Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
There's a duvet which had semen on it. We upgraded that, did a DNA profile and got a full DNA profile that didn't match the boyfriend, so he could be excluded. Then we believed that was from the offender, so we concentrated on that profile from then on.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking they still haunt our imaginations.
Forensic science has become a critical part of police investigations, sometimes the key to cracking cases, often providing the hard evidence to convict criminals. In this episode, we interview an eminent guest, former special advisor with the Forensic Science Service of the Metropolitan Police, Ray Fysh. Ray received 7 police commendations and pioneered techniques which are now standard in solving crimes. In his decades at the Met, he helped crack some of Britain's most notorious crimes, including child murders which shook the nation, and pushed forensic science to its limits, stories which he explores in detail in his memoir, Shallow Graves. In this episode, we'll discuss 3 major cases Ray's worked on: the abduction and murder of 8-year-old Sarah Payne, the M25 Rapist, Anthony Imiela, and the 1987 Bedsit murders, finally solved thanks to forensics in 2020. These cases span Ray's career and demonstrate the evolution of forensics in that time.
Ray, welcome to True Criminals. It's a real privilege to have you join us.
Thank you, Martin.
It really is good to see you. Over my many years of crime reporting, I've watched you and your team become the go-to forensic specialists. You've made all the difference in solving cases. Now, when we've crossed paths over the years, when we're both working, you weren't really in a position to tell me what was going on. I hope things have changed now that you're retired and I'm doing different things. Let me start with this. How crucial are forensics in broad terms?
Forensic science in any major crime basically is really the centre of the investigation. And one thing I tried to do throughout my career as a specialist advisor was really make sure that forensic science runs alongside the inquiry and sometimes drives the inquiry into new investigative avenues. Years ago, when I first joined in the 70s, forensic science was seen very much as the add-on to the case. Police officers submitted exhibits to the laboratory. After many months, they may get a report back, which may have some bearing on their case or not. It wasn't seen as central to the police investigation. And quite often we heard, you do your little bits of science, we'll do the investigation, and we'll see it out of the two. Well, I tried to change that and get forensic science right at the front of their thoughts and everything. And I think we succeeded in doing that in many of the cases. One, which I know you're familiar with, Martin, the Adam case. We drove investigations there. And also when the 2005 bombings came up, we ran very much alongside the SO13 investigation team.
We'll explore some of those stories a little bit later on in the episode, Ray, but let's start, if we can, with the Sarah Payne case, which listeners can hear all about in our episodes 17 and 18 of True Criminals. Actually, Martin, remind us first of all just what happened.
It's a powerful example of a case which really underscores the crucial role of forensic evidence, because in Sarah's abduction and murder, it was science that ultimately brought her killer to justice, even though the police had their prime suspect within, I think, 24 hours of Sarah's disappearance. But although everything pointed to Roy Whiting as the right suspect, there was still an awful lot of work to be done. And crucially, it was the work of Ray and his team that finally nailed him. Now, just to recap, Sarah was 8 years old, a bright little girl. She was playing with her siblings in a cornfield on a summer evening. In just a few minutes, she nipped through a hedge and vanished that July day in West Sussex. The entire country was transfixed. 17 days later, her body was found in a field about 15 miles from where she disappeared, not far from where I lived, where I still live. The cause of death was thought to be strangulation or suffocation. The problem in ascertaining exactly how she died was that there was so much decomposition. The investigation, codenamed Operation Maple, was huge and quickly honed in on that suspect, Roy Whiting. He was a local man with a history of crimes against children, but even then, building a case against him was a massive challenge. Ray, I remember sitting in Lewes Crown Court in 2001 as the evidence was revealed, and it was astounding, the revelation of that forensic evidence. Talk us through what your team did.
Well, let's start with Roy Whiting. Roy Whiting was arrested on day 2 of the inquiry. Police decided to make welfare checks on all known local paedophiles in the area, the immediate area where Sarah was abducted. And number 2 on the list was Roy Whiting. So they went round to Whiting's house, interviewed him, and immediately he opened the door. Police were alerted. Whiting was normally quite a scruffy individual and was soapy in appearance. But this night, he looked like he'd been put through a car wash backwards. He was totally cleaned up and his clothes were clean and everything. He was also evasive in his answers. And police went outside to think about what they were going to do with Whiting. They sat in their car when Whiting appeared from his flat and went to the back of a white Fiat Ducato van and seemed to remove something. Now, this was odd because police had no knowledge of Whiting owning a white van. And what was significant was when Sarah left the field, immediately behind her was her older brother, Lee. And Lee saw a white, large van speed past him on the way to his grandparents' house. That was two and two put together, and the white van became obvious then of its significance. So police went up, and Steve Wagstaff, the DS with Sussex Police, arrested Whiting there and then on the suspicion of the abduction of Sarah Payne. So immediately we had that van. That van became crucial. If she had been abducted in that van, us getting hold of that van as early as possible is crucial. That van was taken into police custody when it was examined. Now, Whiting had purchased this van the week before from a person who did house removals. But he not only purchased the van, he purchased all the rubbish that was inside it, which included drinks cartons, food, sweet wrappers, clothing such as socks, and numerous cigarette ends and numerous other detritus. That van had to be treated very, very carefully. And over a number of days, the scenes of crime officers at Sussex Police did a wonderful job of exhibiting over 160 exhibits from that van alone, which were submitted to the Forensic Science Service, with the pure aim of deciding whether or not Sarah Payne had been in that van.
Give us a sense, Ray, of when they're combing through that mountains of material, what are the forensic teams trying to look for to establish that in this case Sarah had been in the van?
Well, they're looking to link something from Sarah, fingerprints, DNA, something that will link Sarah to the inside of that van. Now, there was a lot of exhibits which were so-called quick wins, things like drink cartons that can be swabbed and DNA profiled quickly, cigarette ends. If Whiting was involved, was he working alone? Did he have an accomplice? So who else has been in that van?
You're also looking for fibres, hairs?
Well, any clothing exhibit, as soon as that exhibit comes into the laboratory, the first thing that's done with that exhibit is taped with sellotape to recover all loose fibres and hairs. Those are then just retained and other tests go on and with the exhibits. But they're all retained for later in case we need to go back to them. So yes, hairs, fibres all come into play. But first of all, it would have been the quick wins, and a large amount of work was done on DNA, basically, see if we could get the DNA of Sarah. Obviously, if we got the DNA of Sarah inside the van, that would be a huge way to go and prove that Whiting was involved.
And the evidence you uncovered did prove Sarah had been in Whiting's van, didn't it?
Well, it was about 6 months of work we'd done, a lot of DNA work, and we'd absolutely got no evidence of Sarah Payne being in that van. But then we come up with a bit of a breakthrough. When Sarah's body, which was 15 days after she was abducted, was found in a field near Pulborough, a member of the public found a child's shoe in the road. And she'd driven past this over a couple of days. But when her body was found, this possible significance became obvious to her. She reported that to the police. That shoe was recovered and submitted to the laboratory. On examination of that shoe, we noticed that it had a Velcro strap. Now, a Velcro strap is excellent. What it does do is trap fibres, masses of them. The whole way Velcro works through the hook and key principle traps these fibres. The scientist recovered all of the fibres from the Velcro strap. There was 340 fibres recovered. Each of those were placed on acetate sheet so they could be examined, colour, fibre type, etc. As the scientist was going through it, she noticed a bright red fibre. And she thought, hold on, I've seen this type of fibre on another exhibit that I've examined, but she couldn't remember which one to start with. And then it came back to her. It was a red sweatshirt that had been found in the front of Whiting's van. So when they examined the fibres and did their various tests on the fibres, the two fibres could not be distinguished from each other. So one fibre matched the other.
That sounded like a real eureka moment. It's astonishing that that shoe had been in the road, 5 weeks after Sarah was abducted, yet it still yielded this mountain of forensic evidence.
That's the power of the Velcro, because it just locks the fibres in there. One of the things about the shoe was that Sarah's mother, Sarah, couldn't identify the shoe as positively being from Sarah. We did various work, fingerprint, DNA work. We never got any evidence, but the shoe was Sarah's because we eventually matched fibres from the shoe to fibres that were taken from a home address from her school uniform.
And the real clincher was a strand of Sarah's hair.
Well, there was another fibre, first of all, found, which was a multicolour fibre from a so-called clown curtain. That was a multicolour fibre, which makes it evidentially far more discriminatory. So we had the two fibres. That led us back then to look at the red sweatshirt and the tape-ins that were originally taken from that exhibit. When we looked at the tape-ins, there were 24 hairs on those tape-ins, but one was around 9 inches long, blonde, exactly the same profile as Sarah's hair. That led on possibility of getting DNA. Now, for hair to yield DNA profile, it needs to have good, healthy root material to get a DNA profile. Fortunately, this hair had that, so we submitted it for DNA. Those days, we were turning DNA round results in about 24 hours. So it was a 24-hour wait until we got the result back. The result came back, full profile, matching Sarah Payne.
Roy, on a personal note, I know you're working as a professional, but how did you feel when that DNA match came back?
Relieved in that all the work that had been put in before wasn't a waste of time, that we actually got it. When I rang the result through to Peter Kennett, who was the detective superintendent, one of the two SIOs, his remark was brilliant. I'll now go and charge Whiting, then I'm going to run along Littlehampton Beach naked. That was his result.
Wow, he must have been very relieved.
It was actually got to the stage of charging Whiting.
Did he run along the beach naked?
I hope not. The people in Littlehampton.
Because of those traces, Whiting was finally charged with Sarah's abduction and murder in February 2001, 7 months after she disappeared on that summer's day. Forensics was front and centre of the trial and subsequent conviction in the November, wasn't it?
Yes. However, there was a bit of a issue that arose. After Whiting was charged and everything, the defence team got together with defence scientists the defence scientists examined all our results. The defence were particularly keen on 2 hairbrushes that were taken early on in the inquiry from Sarah's home in Hersham. And when they looked, these hairbrushes had been put in standard forensic exhibits bags, which are sealed across the top. These 2 exhibits came up as a batch of 55 exhibits one day. There were 2 sacks of exhibits. One sack of exhibits contained exhibits from Hersham Road, Sarah's home address, the other from Whiting's van, and that other sack contained the red sweatshirt. When they looked at the 2 exhibits containing the hairbrushes, there were hairs seen across the adhesive seal. These hairs were long blonde hairs. So the immediate thing came, they put together that the hair on the sweatshirt came from contamination. We countered that in the court by saying, well, look, the exhibits are basically sealed in forensic exhibit bags. They were put in one sack with all the exhibits from Hersham. The other exhibit, which contained the red sweatshirt was put in its own exhibit bag. When those 2 bags come to the laboratory, they were stored. In fact, the hairbrushes never left the exhibit store. They were never examined by the scientist, whereas the sweatshirt had. So the chances of the contamination going across, the scientist said, was unlikely. I'd put it stronger than that, I really would. There is no way that those 2 exhibits would have crossed each other.
So you saw off the defence at that point. The prosecution at the trial said that that one hair was perhaps the most important single item in the case. And in that moment, and I remember being there, everybody in court kind of felt, even knew that Whiting was done for. I remember the relief and applause in the courtroom when the guilty verdict came. I'm sure you do too. But it was mixed with sorrow, of course. But at least the man who did it was behind bars for good. How do you feel, Ray? After all that painstaking work, it still took all that to get him convicted when, to most of us who knew about him and had seen the other evidence, felt he must have done it. But it still took your team all that time to find that forensic evidence.
Well, that's the system we live in. That's the system we work in. It's our job then to put the evidence before the court to get that conviction. I still believe in the jury system. Some of the verdicts are perverse, but I still believe in the jury system. It's our job to make sure that that evidence is watertight, that we can get it across 2 juries to get that conviction.
Well, I'm sure Sarah's family were very relieved that so much time and effort had been put into that and that finally he was behind bars for good. The next case we'd love to look at with you, Ray, is from just a year or so later, a serial rapist who terrorised southeast England in the early 2000s. This investigation was codenamed Operation Orb. Anthony Imiela was dubbed the M25 Rapist because many of his crimes were committed near the motorway. Martin, what was the public mood like at the time of these attacks?
It was one of fear and urgency, I suppose, and the hope that he would be caught very quickly. It was a horrible crime spree. In 2001 and 2002, a man was raping females ranging from a 10-year-old girl to women in their 50s. These attacks happened across Kent, Surrey, London. There was even one in Birmingham. I remember police issuing warnings to women not to go out alone at night. There was real fear and loathing. It felt like no woman, no female, was safe. The pressure on the police was immense because they knew that the rapist was likely to strike again and again until he was caught.
Ray, he was, thankfully, eventually caught, largely thanks to DNA evidence and the new national database. Just explain to us how he was caught.
Can I just first reiterate the panic that was going on? That was even being felt in the investigation team.
Was it?
Yeah, we realised that we had to get this man. I'll go back to the start of it. It was in November 2001 when a 10-year-old girl attended a youth club in a fairly socially deprived area of Ashford called Stanhope. She attended this youth club. At about 9 o'clock, she was sent out to collect the posters advertising the youth club. When she was lifted from the ground, hand put across her face and abducted, basically. She was subsequently violently sexually assaulted several times, including rape. I got a call next morning from the incident room saying we need some urgent examination on intimate swabs from this young girl. They were blue lighted up to the lab. I had a scientist on standby to get them examined for semen. Semen was present. That required urgent DNA analysis. And as I've already said, we're turning around urgent DNA analysis about 24 hours in this time. So this was a Friday when they came up to us, so it'd be a Saturday morning when the results came out. I went into the laboratory on Saturday. The results had come out. We then needed that searched on the database. And at that time, we had nobody working on the database on Saturday. So we had to call people out, get them to search the database. Search the database and nothing, not a match at all, not to a person or another crime scene. So it was real disappointment that we got a rape of a 10-year-old girl and no suspect.
He'd made a mistake, hadn't he, which gave you the window of opportunity?
Yes. He didn't take precautions and he left semen behind, which gave us his DNA profile, which is relevant later. So a large investigation went on for around 7 months at Kent, trying to find this person, the DNA from this person. And we got nowhere, basically. It was then, in July 2002, when I received a phone call from National Database saying, you're raping a 10-year-old girl. We've got another crime scene that matches it. When I looked into that crime, it was a 30-year-old woman that had been raped whilst she was out walking her dog. But this time the offender had used a condom. So there was no semen present. However, he had become a bit amorous during the rape and he actually licked the victim's ear. A swab from that ear was taken and it gave a partial profile, which means that not all the DNA areas have been decoded, it's only partial. But where it had decoded, it matched that of the 10-year-old rape. So we got 7 months apart, a rape of a 10-year-old girl, followed up by a rape of a 30-year-old girl in different police forces.
The point was, Ray, that even though you had partial DNA or DNA profile, the suspect hadn't committed any crimes before. So that's why his profile wasn't on the database.
He had been submitted to the database. He may have committed crimes. He may have been known to police, but his DNA wasn't on the database.
By mid-2002, with several more rapes happening, police actually announced, didn't they, Ray, that they had the perpetrator's DNA profile and urged the public to help identify him. And that was quite striking, basically saying, we know who he is genetically, we just need his name. I suppose that shows how confident they were about the science.
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, the science with linking the two, there was a lot of discussion amongst a lot of senior police officers whether or not these two cases should be formally linked or not. That took place in a hotel near Brands Hatch, that discussion. I was asked my opinion. I said, you've got to trust the science, basically. And unfortunately, they did. So a cross-border investigation with Kent, Sussex, Metropolitan Police and Thames Valley and Hertfordshire was set up, because several other cases had come into the pot, which may be from the same offender. So we did have the DNA from this offender. And we went on and what was known as an intelligent-led DNA screen, where it's a cheap and cheerful way of doing DNA profiles, but getting large numbers of people to give samples so they can be eliminated. And I've always said, when they set those up, listen to members of the public, listen to the people that are forwarding names. And that was the crucial thing. When the case went on Crime Watch, a neighbour of Anthony Imiela actually rung in with his name. The reason she rang in is because he approached her and tried it on with her.
Martin, I'm sure you'll remember this, the woman growing suspicious of her neighbour. What did she say? Who did she say he was?
She said he was a 49-year-old former railway worker with a history of violent crime. He'd been in jail in the 1980s for robbery, but he wasn't on the DNA database. Now, this neighbour noticed that he resembled a composite sketch that had been released by police. She'd seen it as part of the widening police appeals for help. And she said that he had some odd habits. So she called the police. They started surveillance on Imiela. And then, Ray, this is where the science comes in again, isn't it?
Yes. So Imiela was contacted by police saying, we need to take a DNA sample from you. He protested his innocence. He said, I can't do it now. I'm at work in Southampton. He lived in Appledore, which is about 10 miles south of Ashford. I don't want you coming down here to my workplace. I will do it at home. So they arranged that evening to meet him at his home address in Appledore. He still protested his innocence, to which his wife turned around and said, you've got nothing to hide, giving me a DNA sample. But he knew as soon as that swab went in his mouth, there's only days left of his freedom. And because he even asked how long it would take to get the result, and they told him 7 to 10 days. So 7 to 10 days, he knew he was going to be arrested for the various rapes.
It's chilling to think, isn't it, that he was bold enough to carry on offending even after he knew that police had his DNA.
Yeah. He had his last thing 2 days after the swab was taken. He got in his car and drove to Birmingham, where he told a 10-year-old girl to get into his car, which was the start of a 5-hour ordeal for this poor girl. She survived that and was good enough to give identification of Imiela. But a terrible thing. So when the result came out, it matched. I phoned it through to Colin Murray, who was the DCI from Kent. They then started to set about planning his arrest that evening. He was working in Southampton again on the railways. They then pinged his phone, basically following up the M3. However, his phone stopped at one time at Eastleigh, and they were concerned that he was committing another offence. Fortunately, it turned out he was only stopped for fish and chips. They then carried on pinging his phone up the M3, onto the M25, down onto the M20, and they did a stop around Junction 7 Maidstone and arrested Imiela.
It was a really horrific case, wasn't it? In 2004, he went on trial at Maidstone Crown Court. I was there when the verdict came in. He was found guilty of 7 rapes and given 7 life sentences, 1 for each of his victims. The judge called him, sure you'll remember this, Ray, a ruthless sexual predator, and noted how he even taunted a victim's mother on the phone during his crime spree. Imiela also got an additional 29 years for the abduction and indecent assault of the 10-year-old, since that was considered separately. He'll effectively never be released.
What are your memories, Ray, of that moment when the judge called him a ruthless sexual predator and you knew that his shocking spree was over?
Probably relief that all that hard work had come and it had proven safe. Imiela at trial, he never admitted to anything. So we actually had to prove every piece of evidence. So there was a lot of preparation for trial and everything. I think there's one part of the trial that I will relate, is that when the 52-year-old was giving evidence, she was asked, how do you know that penetration had definitely occurred? And she said, well, it's a bit difficult, really, because he's quite small. So I didn't know whether he actually penetrated me or not, which gave huge relief to the court and embarrassment to Imiela.
Oh, dear. His poor wife as well. Presumably his wife knew nothing of this, did she, Martin?
She was all for him giving that voluntary DNA sample, and look where that got him. And you talk about the 52-year-old Ray giving evidence. Obviously, a number of his victims testified, and you can only imagine the courage that they needed to do that. But there was the scientific evidence that you had accumulated, and the DNA evidence particularly meant that those victims didn't have to rely solely on identification. Effectively, the science backed up their stories.
Yeah, it was the DNA, but also there was a large amount of fibre evidence against him as well. On the victim's clothing, when we examined those, there were large numbers of orange and yellow fluorescent fibres, which had actually come from his high-vis jacket, which he used to take off before raping the women, and the fibres attached to his clothes had been transferred onto their clothing. There were also fibres of a purple flock curtain, which he used to open kindly for his wife every morning, got those onto his clothes. Those were transferred to the victims as well. So there was a large amount of fibre evidence went with it.
There was one interesting aspect that caught my eye, that in the trial, the prosecution pointed out, Martin, that Imiela took more care after his first attack, using condoms and avoiding leaving traces. But I suppose what he didn't realise, that was too late, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a terrible mistake for him that he hadn't been so careful, and leaving behind semen during that first attack, he left a trail that would catch him.
Exactly. We had that DNA profile. One thing we had to do was identify that person. And if it wasn't for that member of the public, we probably would still be looking today, to be quite honest. He didn't fit the offender profilers the rapists they were looking for. If you know Imiela's background, he was basically an armed robber from the northeast. After his sentence for the armed robbery, came south and started a new life, basically.
In Operation Orb, it was cooperation, wasn't it, between police forces and the use of the national DNA database that were really both key?
Yeah. Cooperation of the police forces.
Tell us more.
You sound a bit cynical.
When you've got a normal murder inquiry, you've normally got one SIO, one senior investigating officer. You know this, Martin. He calls all the shots, basically. He dictates lines of inquiry. When you got a cross-border inquiry, we had 6 or 7 SIOs all sitting around the table, all wanted their inquiry prioritised over everybody else's. So you were trying to handle 6 or 7 requests from SIOs, every one of them wanting theirs prioritised.
It is ridiculous, isn't it, that we have 43 police forces in England and Wales. They all have different protocols, different ways of doing things. I was talking to the Chief Inspector of Constabulary in the last few days, and he told me that there has to be a cutting down of the number of forces. He envisaged, and I think this is generally thought amongst policing, you don't want 4 or 5 big regional forces, like 5 or 6 METs, Metropolitan Police Organisations. You want perhaps a dozen or 15 regional forces that would get around the problem that you're talking about, that you encountered in the Imiela investigation.
But you got 43 chief constables wanting their jobs. Several of them are going to lose their jobs.
I guess they're going to have to live with that. But from your perspective, fewer chief investigators, senior investigators, would make your life a lot easier.
Yes. Cross-border inquiries are fairly rare. I've been involved with Prosecute 2, and they are stressful and they are demanding.
No, I can imagine.
The other thing, the so-called OIC, which is above the SIOs, the officer in overall command, he has to be strong. And I'm afraid the one in Orb wasn't. And his lack of forensic knowledge was quite remarkable for a senior officer.
It's a good acronym, OIC.
Yeah.
Our final case in this episode is a cold case breakthrough. This is Operation Greenfinch, the re-investigation of the Tunbridge Wells Bedsit murders. 2 young women, 25-year-old Wendy Nell and 20-year-old Caroline Pierce, were murdered 5 months apart in 1987.
Both of them lived alone in Bedsits, I suppose what estate agents might call today bijou studio apartments, in Tunbridge Wells in Kent. Wendy Nell was the manager of a Super Snaps store in Tunbridge Wells, where, it turned out later, the killer took photographs to be developed. Her boyfriend found Wendy's naked body in the blood-stained bed of her bedsit in June 1987. She'd been sexually assaulted and strangled. 5 months later, the body of waitress Caroline Pierce was found naked, apart from a pair of tights, by a farm worker in a flooded drain 40 miles away in Romney. Those murders remained unsolved for many years. Ray, after the millennium, developments in forensic science started to really change, didn't they?
After 2000, when DNA was really just developing, it introduced a new system, SGM+, which looked at 10 areas of DNA, and sensitivity was getting better. There was a big push to look at old cold cases. These are cases that are basically unsolved, and look back where they couldn't get any scientific evidence at the time of the murder. They started to look at these again with the advent of new DNA techniques. And in the early 2000s, the cases of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce landed on my desk to review it and see if there's anything we could push forward. One thing that struck out was there was a duvet which had semen on it. Now, they'd done limited blood grouping at the time, which didn't take them very far. We upgraded that semen stain, did a DNA profile and got a full DNA profile that didn't match the boyfriend, so he could be excluded. But then we believed that was from the offender, so we concentrated on that profile from then on to try and hunt for the offender. We started to think about familial searching. So the offender's not on the database, but is a close relation of his, a parent, a child, a brother or sister. Are they on the database? And we can get to the offender through that profile. Because
relatives share similarities in DNA?
Yes. In parent-child, if we look at 10 areas of DNA, which we did in SGM Plus at the time, they must share at least one number out of the two with the parent-child, and that must be from each area. So if any area they don't share a number, they can be excluded as a parent-child relationship. And me and you, Martin, we're not related. If we looked at our DNA profiles, we'd probably share about 4 or 5 of the alleles or the numbers between each other out of 20. So non-relatives, 4 or 5. If you get 2 siblings, they'll share 12, 13, maybe more, maybe slightly less, but maybe more. So that gives you an indication that people may be siblings. So you go through basically sifting the database. Possible parent-child, yes, no. Siblings, possibly, yes, no. And you end up with lists. And what you can do with these lists is basically prioritise looking at age, because if you've got a sibling of an offender, they tend to be within plus or minus 5 years of each other, if on the outside, plus or minus 10. So you can start doing things with ages. And also geography as well, look at geography. So you can start prioritising these people, and then you can do some also with some more complex DNA work. So you can start getting an idea. Now, we did this search probably the first time about 2004. We worked through it, never got any clear leads. That was repeated in 2007 and 2010, because every time you do a familial search, immediately you do it, it's out of date, because more people are going onto the database each day. So it's out of date. So you keep having to repeat the process. In my time at the Forensic Science Service, we carried out the familial search 3 times, never got anywhere. Then the Conservative government shut us down. So I was out of the game then. But fortunately, I knew Kent Police were going to continue with that line of inquiry at a later stage.
So how did it help the familial DNA search in Operation Greenfinch?
Well, in the end, fortunately, I heard that after I'd left in 2019, they carried out another familial profile. New superintendent had taken over the case, Ivan Beasley. He'd said we'd do another familial search. And this time, once they went through the whole process again, one name came out, name of Fuller.
The familial DNA searches threw up 90 possible relatives of the culprit. Where did the investigation go from there, Ray?
When the police received the familial search results back, they noticed there was 90 individuals that were possible relatives. And I must stress they're possible relatives of the offender. Now, they sent out, and this is during the COVID period they were doing this, investigating officers to get samples of DNA from each of these individuals. The reason being they couldn't use the sample that was submitted for the database. They had to go back and get a fresh evidential sample. And from those fresh evidential samples, they did the DNA profiling again, upgrading it from what was known at the time of SGM Plus to a new technique called DNA 17, where we looked at 16 areas of DNA. That made it more discriminatory in the familial search thing that you do again. When applied to these 90 samples, one name really stood out. It was that of David Fuller, and police then concentrated on the relatives of David Fuller.
He had lived in the area at the time of the murders, hadn't he?
He lived just across the border in East Sussex. He was interviewed in the original inquiry, I believe, but they never had any evidence against him.
So, Ray, once Fuller was identified as a possible suspect, this hospital electrician, how did detectives confirm that he was the killer after all those years?
They obtained a potential DNA sample from him that matched the DNA profile from Wendy Nell, the duvet, and other similar profiles found around the flat. The Caroline Pierce case, new technology had managed to get a partial profile from her tights because she had been submerged in a dike in New Romney. They managed to get a partial profile from the tights, which matched the profile of the case from Wendy Nell, which in turn matched David Fuller.
Ray, faced with the evidence that was mounting against him, Fuller pleaded guilty in 2021.
Eventually.
While he was on trial, he changed his plea, I think.
Yeah.
That, at least, spared the families the ordeal of a lengthy trial. I reported on the trial from outside the court when that happened. It was incredible that after 33 years, Wendy's and Caroline's surviving relatives had answers and expressed, I suppose, both relief that justice had finally been done, but anguish at the horrors that came to light next, because catching Fuller solved the Bedsit murders, but it also exposed an entirely different crime spree, one that Kent Police had briefed crime reporters on, and it was astonishing, wasn't it?
I was working at Canterbury Christchurch University when the news one morning announced the arrest of a man for the murders of Wendy Nell, Caroline Pierce. Obviously, my ears pricked up at that stage, having dealt with this case. So I phoned colleagues I knew from Kent Police and said, well done, congratulations. How did it happen? What's the story behind it? They said, sorry, Ray, we're on a press embargo. Nobody can say anything to anybody. I said, come on, I worked on the case. They said, sorry, we're not telling you. So I didn't know. I racked my brains and thought, is it linked to another unsolved murder in Kent? Went through all the unsolved murders in Kent, didn't see many links there. And I had no idea. And when eventually it came out that he'd indecently assaulted patients in mortuaries and hospitals.
Ray, you should have rung me. We'd been briefed by Kent Police and sworn to secrecy.
Oh, Martin, now you tell me.
Didn't they call it the morgue monster revelations, Martin?
They did, and it came about like this. When police searched Fuller's home after his arrest, they discovered hard drives filled with images and videos of him sexually abusing corpses in hospital morgues. Extraordinary stuff. It turned out that during his years as a hospital maintenance worker, he'd had access to mortuaries and had violated at least 100 dead women and girls aged from 9 to 100. It's almost impossible to believe and understand what drove that, and the fact that he'd actually documented these acts.
And was really, I think, Martin, living, a really macabre double life.
Exactly that. To all appearances, Fuller was a mild-mannered grandfather figure, but also a heinous predator. He would likely have died an innocent man had it not been for this cold case DNA investigation. And instead, because of that, he's now one of Britain's most notorious sex offenders.
Well, he received 2 whole-life prison terms for the murders, meaning he'll never be released, plus additional years for the morgue offences. And there's been a nationwide inquiry into how he was able to abuse bodies for so long without detection. It's disturbing on so many levels. But from the forensic science standpoint, Ray, the takeaway is that familial DNA techniques caught a killer who thought he'd long gotten away with it.
Yes. I was asked a question once, in fact, when I was doing my book, Unfinished Business. Is there one case that you think is really unfinished business? Most people would think I'd say Adam, and you know the story of Adam. But I always said, no, it's the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce. We're so close to solving that it'd just take a little breakthrough and we'll get over the line. And it was that breakthrough of his brother's DNA going onto the database in 2011, the persistence of Kent Police doing the familial search again that led to his eventual capture.
And the understanding and techniques of familial DNA searches had roots in an earlier case. You've just mentioned it, the Adam case, the Thames torso case that you were very heavily involved in. That was the case of the boy known only as Adam, whose torso, no head, no limbs, was found in the River Thames in 2001. Now, this was a case that we explored in detail in episodes 15 and 16 of this podcast, Ray. It was a tragic, unusual case, and it never saw a conviction, but it did spur innovation in forensics that you were at the heart of.
Yes, I've got to say I was really lucky to be involved with that case. Lucky in that they had an SIO in Will O'Reilly and Commander Andy Baker, his boss, basically, who drove me to get answers to questions that they posed. And they posed some fairly difficult questions, but they gave me a blank sheet of paper, basically, and said, look, just find out as much about this boy as you can from science. And they really pushed that, which led to several techniques really being developed and now routine. And one of them was familial searching. Today we do familial searching with all the computer programs that we got access to and everything, and it's really just feeding numbers into computers. In Adam, we didn't have that because it had never been done before. And it was basically done on pen and paper in my back room over a couple of weekends that we eventually identified 35 men and 11 women who couldn't be excluded as being the parents of Adam. And those names were given to the investigation team. They were traced and they were eliminated. Now, we never got anywhere with that, but it was the first real case that we did familial searching on.
And not long after that, familial DNA helped solve other cases, didn't it?
Yes, there's a couple. There's the one of Cappin in South Wales, notoriously known for being the first posthumous DNA pit, if you like. He'd murdered 2 young girls in South Wales. Familial search carried out, matched a name of a young boy came up. He couldn't have been the offender because he was only, I believe, 9 at the time of the offences. So they looked into his background and lo and behold, his father, who had been interviewed in the initial inquiry, his name came up. He had since subsequently died. They exhumed his body, got a DNA profile, and it matched the crime stain. And then there's quite a famous one where a brick was thrown through a lorry window on the M3 and the driver killed. That brick was swabbed on the outside, a DNA profile obtained. Didn't match anybody on the database, but did match a close relative of the person who eventually got found guilty.
And that's what allowed cases like David Fuller's to be cracked years later, that pioneering work. So in a way, Ray, Adam's case, unsolved as it was, pushed forensic science forward.
Yes, in not only the DNA, but other methods as well, which brought to that. And we got to learn, or I got to learn then, that really forensic science piggybacks other scientific techniques, such as archaeology, etc., etc. We just use the methods that they've been using routinely. And when I became this specialist advisor in this coordinator role, I found that Forensic Science Service had a lot to offer in particularly DNA, and they become specialists in DNA. Whereas universities have got large numbers of techniques that they're all beavering away doing their academic stuff, which could be applicable to forensic science. And it's getting into those and understanding those that makes it important. And I've got to say, I would give a name check to Andy Baker and Will O'Reilly. They really pushed that inquiry forward.
We had Andy Baker on an earlier episode about the Adam case, and you talk about working with him. He mentioned you and gave great praise to the pioneering stuff that you did. We've talked today about 3 different stories, but they're united by the theme of forensic breakthroughs. In Sarah Payne's case, classic trace evidence, fibres, a single hair, DNA, nailed a child murderer. In Anthony Imiela's case, the growing national DNA database and cross-county cooperation stopped a serial rapist. In the Bedsit murders, cutting-edge familial DNA searching and genetic genealogy solved crimes once thought unsolvable. It really does show, doesn't it, the evolution of forensic science over the decades. Ray, from a forensic scientist perspective, you lived through this evolution. You started in the 1970s when forensic science was still finding its footing. Could you have imagined back then the tools you'd be using by the 2000s and the 2010s before your retirement?
No, when I joined forensic science, there was very little scientific instrumentation, if you like. It was very much test tubes and Bunsen burners and materials like that. I can still remember the amazement of this thing called a scanning electron microscope, which we take as so common these days, being first introduced into forensic science in about 74. This machine coming in that is going to do the job for some of us. And if you look back where we use DNA today, what they had in those days was the old blood grouping systems where we looked at ABO blood grouping and perhaps a few other markers in blood, which if they got a discrimination of 1 in 25, they was dancing on the ceiling almost. Now we talk about 1 in a billion. So that's how science has progressed. And you've got to remember that Alec Jeffreys, who introduced DNA into forensic science, wasn't looking at forensic science at that time. He was looking to how certain drugs work on certain people, how they work better on certain people than others. And he thought it was something to do with their genetic makeup. And it's only when he started profiling and realised that these profiles meant something, it was introduced into forensic science. It's another where forensic science has piggybacked other people's work.
It sounds, Ray, as if each major case has brought innovations with it and that you went from needing a visible blood stain to convict somebody in the 70s to being able to sequence a few skin cells from a 30-year-old piece of evidence and use that to find a killer's cousin. It's like science fiction.
Well, I hope it's not fiction because we gave evidence in court about it. So it's progressing. It still will progress. Even though I'm out of it now, it still will progress. I don't think DNA will get too much more sensitive, but think of the intelligence that you could possibly start building. A photo fit of the offender, hair colour, eye colour, build, personality traits, anything that's genetically inherited from DNA, you could start building this photo fit picture of the offender. And I know there's work going on in Holland at the moment around this.
As we close, Ray, here's a sobering thought that for all that we have discussed about the wonders of forensic science, people are still prosecuted today without forensic evidence, and they're convicted. But I suppose my thought is that when famous high-profile cases are looked at again and there are appeals at the appeal court and people do have their convictions overturned, it tends to be the cases where there was no forensic evidence in the first place. Thank you, Ray, for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hey listeners, your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.